Today we are privileged to host Ellen Elias-Bursac, an American scholar and senior translator who has dedicated her career to the study and translation of South Slavic languages. As the past president of the American Literary Translators Association, ALTA, she has been a driving force in promoting literary translation. In this conversation, she shared her fascinating journey into literature, her significant work in ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, ALTA, translating dialect and translations of Serbian author David Albahari. Ellen Elias-Bursac translates fiction and non-fiction from the Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin and Serbian languages. In 2006, the novel Götz and Meyer by David Albahari in her Serbian translation was given the National Translation Award, and she received the Mary Zirin Prize from the Association of Women in Slavic Studies in 2015. She has also written and contributed to books and articles on translation studies and South Slavic language instruction. Her monumental work, recording the trial proceedings at ICTY, is titled as Translating Evidence and Interpreting Testimony at a War Crimes Tribunal, Working in a Tug-of-War. She is a past president of the American Literary Translators Association. To read more about ICTY, there is a link provided in the show notes. And to buy Ellen's translations, there is an Amazon link too. Welcome to Harshaneeyam podcast, Ellen. Such an honor to have you with us.
Oh, I'm honored to be asked. I was really touched that you got in touch.
So kind of you to say that. Now, I read that when you were in school, you wanted to be an archaeologist and a mystery writer.
Yes, I had great admiration for Agatha Christie, who was a mystery writer and married to an archaeologist. So that intrigued me when I was little. Well, I was amused when I saw your question because when I was a little girl, I loved the idea of writing. And there was a girl who lived right across the street from me. In fact, we're still friends. And she and I wrote a novel together when I think we only got as far as halfway through the second chapter before it sort of fizzled out. But we had this project and she and I would each write our chapter and then we'd come together and make them together. And my mothers were so enthusiastic that they typed it all up. And lately I was going through my papers that my parents had all these years, and that I took from their house after they passed, and discovered that the manuscript that our mothers typed was still there. So I showed it to my friend, and she was...
What was your age then?
Probably 5th or 6th year of elementary school, something like that. I was probably 12 or 13, something like that.
Can you read a paragraph if you have it?
No, I don't have it in front of me. I'm sorry, but it was just a very funny thing. We were fascinated by the Underground Railroad, and because we'd heard that there was a part of the Underground Railroad not too far from where we lived here in Cambridge. I grew up here in Massachusetts, where I live now, not in the same house, but not too far from it. And we lived right across the street from each other. So we had all these ideas about their tunnels between our houses. There were no tunnels between our houses, but we imagined that there were people hiding in our basement. Anyway, that was our story.
I hope someday you will publish it.
Oh, no. I don't think only a tiny bit of it is. I don't really remember how much of it that we wrote, but a tiny bit of it remains intact. So
now, your aunt Barbara Elias was a poet too. What kind of influence did she have on you?
Well, that's interesting that you raise that, because the reason that it's known that she was a poet is that when she died, a family friend wrote her obituary. He put that she was a poet, but she wasn't I don't believe she ever actually published any of her poetry. It was mostly family poetry. So there'd be events at the family, and she would have a poem that she had written for that event. They were always very funny, and she would write little poems. When she gave us presents for the holidays, there'd be a little poem for the present, which would hint what the present was, but it wouldn't say. It was just, she was very clever about those things. And of course, I never met my grandmother, her mother and my father's mother. She died a long time before my father, when my father was just a child. But she had been an English professor in a high school, in a secondary school. And so both my father and his sister read a great deal and were interested in fiction. And when I started translating, my father would read all my translations and always gave me feedback and was interested in them. And so that was the part of my family. This grandmother I never met was the person who shaped my life the most.
Why South Slavic languages? How did you develop interest in South Slavic languages?
When I was a little girl, it was the Cold War. I was born in the 50s, and my father was a professor here at MIT and Cambridge, and he would bring home Russian engineers to dinner to our house at a time when it was very controversial to speak with Russians. But if they were engineers, it was less controversial because they were interested in technology, and that wasn't so political. So I always thought this was very interesting when I was a child. And I remember once we went to take them out of Boston to Concord and Lexington, which are little towns just outside of Boston, which are famous for their role in the war against the British in the 18th century. And then we were told that we couldn't take them out because it was more than 30 miles from where they were staying, and that in Moscow, Americans weren't allowed to go more than 30 miles from where they were staying in Russia. And I thought this was just so bizarre. And as a child, so then I went to a secondary school here in Boston, which offered Russian as one of the languages it was possible to study, along with French and German and Latin and Greek and Spanish. And I thought Russian was much more interesting than all those other languages. And so I decided that I would focus on that. And then I discovered that although I was sort of an okay student in other things, I was much better at languages. And so then it became clear that that was something I might think about doing with my life, and ended up doing with my life.
Now, when it comes to the languages, there are Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian. These are called South Slavic languages. I was Googling the other day. Is there any difference between these, or they are all same with some kind of dialect?
Well, there are differences. There's small differences. I taught those languages at Harvard for 10 years and wrote a textbook with a colleague of mine where we made every exercise we put in each version. There was a Croatian, a Serbian. And so we had my colleague and I, who wrote the textbook with me, worked very hard to figure out exactly how to say things in each of those versions. And the way I try to explain it, well, first of all, there was a single language, or what was referred to as a single language, called Serbo-Croatian, which was there for many years during Yugoslavia. Then Yugoslavia, there was a terrible war in the 1990s. Yugoslavia broke up into little countries, and each of those countries named their language after their country. So if it was Bosnia, it was Bosnian, Croatia, Croatian, and so forth, Montenegrin and Serbian, Macedonian, Slovenian. But of course, Macedonian and Slovenian were always different languages. They were not the same. So in a way, you could say that that was the same language and that it broke up. But even when I lived there in the 70s and 80s, it was clear that I spoke Croatian. I lived in Zagreb, and that's what was spoken. And if I went to Bosnia or to Serbia as in a visit, I could understand everything, but I couldn't actually speak. I couldn't do it just the way they would do it there. Because the way I like to say is that there's an overlap of about 85%, with 15% are features that are particular to each of those things. There's vocabulary features, there's pronunciation features, there's various things, syntax features that are just a little bit different among them.
So I mean to ask you, if you are proficient in one language and if you start translating it, you mean to say it's easy to translate these other languages too into
Yes,
English?
I can translate from Bosnian or Croatian or Serbian or Montenegrin. There are local issues that come up that I need some help with. But even in Croatia, there are local issues that come up sometimes with particular dialects or regional differences that come up that I need help with. But my Croatian, I'm very comfortable with Croatian.
Literature wise, there is difference. A lot of writers from different parts of these countries.
Well, people who translate into Croatian or into Serbian or into Montenegrin are likely to be specific to those areas. But those of us who work into English from those languages often work with several of them languages. So I have several friends who also translate, and Will Firth works from Serbian, Montenegrin, and Croatian. There's quite a few of us. Paula Gordon also works from Croatian, Montenegrin.
Now, you spent almost 2 decades in Zagreb. So please tell us about your experience in Zagreb.
The reason I ended up in Zagreb was, it's a classic case of one thing leads to another. So I was a student of Russian as an undergraduate at a small college in St. Paul, Minnesota called McAllister. And the professors who ran our program, there were just four professors or three professors actually, and a small group of us who were studying it as our major course of study. Wanted to offer us the opportunity to study in another country to get better at the language. And so they didn't want us to go to the Soviet Union because they were very anti-Soviet. They were themselves expatriate Russians, and they didn't like the Soviet Union and the communist system and everything. So they had this idea that we should go to Germany, to Munich, and study at Radio Free Europe, which gave a Russian class of some kind. And we said, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to go to Munich to study Russian. We want to go to a Slavic country. And then they discovered, the professor then went to work to find out what there was, that he could find a program. And he found a program in Croatia that was part of an exchange with Portland State University in Oregon. And so 4 of us from my generation of students, we went on that program for a year in 1972-73. And then while I was there, I sang in a chorus, and I met somebody else in the chorus, and we began to spend time together, and we got engaged. And then I came back to the States and got my undergraduate degree, and then I went back to Zagreb, and I lived there. And my thinking at the time was that I was going to have to do a master's program anyway, so I might as well do it there. But of course, what I was interested in doing was literature. And if I was going to study the literatures of Yugoslavia, all the students who would be in the master's program with me would have been reading the literatures of Yugoslavia since they were children. And I didn't know anything about the literatures of Yugoslavia. I was learning the language while I was there, but I didn't know the literatures. And so what I did was I took 3 years of an undergraduate minor in the Yugoslav literatures and languages. And they accepted my Russian major from McAllister as my major. And then I did this minor for 3 years. And it was very intense. It was much more intense than a minor in the United States. I had 12 hours a week of classes, and we studied Slovenian, Macedonian, all the literatures and so forth. So I did that for 3 years. And when I finished that and got that degree, then I went on and did the master's program. But the idea was that I would have to do my master's somewhere, so I might as well be doing it there. And then I chose to specialize in those languages and literatures. And then when I finished, I began thinking about coming back to the States for a time. And I realized sometimes in your mind, you you make a trajectory. You don't even realize that somehow I had set it up for myself that I was there for my master's. And when I finished the master's, maybe that would be time to come back to the States. But it didn't happen that way. We didn't come back right away, but we did come back in 1990. And by then I had started on my PhD and I was beginning to work on it. And I did the research for the PhD when we had already moved here to the States in 1990, but I went back and defended it at Zagreb University.
When did the idea of getting into translation crop up?
Well, I always loved translation. And even in high school, when I was good at languages, I was thinking, my parents were both professors. So I had this idea, I will never be a professor. This was my wisdom as a teenager. I will never be a professor, of course.
Why is that?
Well, because that's what they did, and I was going to be different. So when I was in high school, when I was thinking, if I'm good at languages, which I was, what can I do professionally? And so the two things that I could do professionally, if I'm good at languages, were teaching language or translating. And I was much more interested in translating. So even as a high school student, when I was reading translations of Russian literature, I was thinking about the translations. When I got to college, I was thinking about translation a great deal. So when I moved to Zagreb in 1974, when I got married and began to live there, that was what I sort of had as a goal, was to get good enough in Croatian that I could work as a translator. And that's basically what I did most of my life there, was all sorts of different translations, but very different. With the weather, the Meteorology Institute had me translate their abstracts for their research into the winds, or somebody else, a highway report, or I don't know, all sorts of different things.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, when did you get into translating literature?
I was asked to do some first for the first literary translations I did were for the Writers Association in Zagreb, because they published regularly a journal called The Bridge, which published short things or excerpts of longer things from the writers of Croatia. So I translated those things. And then I got interested in translation because I became frustrated with the fact that writers often, when they asked me to do, especially cultural things, maybe a review of somebody's art show or something, they would be very careless about the way what they wrote, and they just would give me this thing to translate. They hadn't even checked it for typographical errors or anything, and I didn't like doing that kind of work. After a while, I got frustrated, so I wanted to work longer things, because it was always just Friday. Friday people would arrive when we had plans for the weekend, and they would say, this has to be done by Monday, and I'd have to change everything and sit down and translate their badly written whatever. So I got tired of that, and then I was interested in finding longer things. So I was looking for novels and stories and things that were written carefully. I wanted good writing. That was what drew me to it first.
Your PhD was in philology, right? So, tell us about philology and how it influenced your translation.
Well, that's an interesting issue, because at the time that my dissertation was actually a translation biography of a very famous Croatian poet named Augustin Ujević, who was the most famous mid 20th century Croatian poet. And he did a lot of translating to help support himself in the course of his time as a writer. And so it was really a translation dissertation. But Zagreb University did not offer a degree in translation. So the closest they could find was philology. They had that a category of philology, because philology is the study of language. And of course, language plays a role in translation, but that's the only connection between philology and my dissertation. It was just, they had categories that I guess the larger university had allowed them to have for their PhDs, and translation studies was not one of those. It is now. Now it's possible. Also, at that time, I had to write my dissertation in Croatian. I had to submit it in Croatian. So I did. That was a challenge, but I did it.
You said attending live performances, it inspires you in translation.
Well, it's interesting. When I'm working on a project, I often find I'm kind of an obsessive person. I have a way of kind of getting carried away with things, and I dream about them, and and everything. And I find when I go, especially music, but also theater, when I see people on stage who are taking risks, they're up there singing or playing an instrument or performing, I admire them, and it takes me out of myself. I can forget myself for a little while. And I find that a relief. And it also frees me up to sort of think freely about things, maybe step away from the particulars, translations of an art or a science or whatever you want to refer to it, an activity that's very detail oriented, and it's such a relief to step away from that kind of detail and just engage with the performance, whatever it is. So that helps me.
When you are translating, do you feel that you are performing?
Well, sort of. It's a performance is kind of a one-time thing. Like you get up there and you recite something. Whereas with translation, I'm an editor in the work that I do. I spend a lot of time editing. So it's a very drawn out process. And what I come up with at the end can be quite different from what I started with. So I'm not sure that I would say I don't experience it like that sort of one-time experience of a performance. It goes through many permutations.
I'm not saying in that sense. Finally, a performer has to interpret it in his own way, right?
Yes.
But translation is also like that, right?
Well, of course, there's definitely an element of performance in.
Yeah, interpretation is there because
I used to read out loud. I don't read out loud as much as I used to, but I do experience the feel of the text is very important to me. The idea of it being experienced by another person is very important to me.
now, is there any specific challenge, the really tough challenge that you encountered in translation?
I've translated many books, and each one of them presented interesting challenges. I think probably the most challenging translation I've had in terms of my own feeling that I didn't that there I wished I could do more. I wished I could do more. I wished I could do more. But so I'm not sure I felt fulfilled at the end. Was a novel called Dark Mother Earth, which by a Croatian writer named Christian Novak. And the reason I found it challenging is because Novak is from a region in Croatia very close to Hungary where they have a very particular dialect. And although the narrator and the sort of the narrative of the story is in the literary language, the two little boys who are at the center of the story speak to each other in this dialect. Dialect is the worst. It's the worst challenge that there is because it is geographically specific. And if I choose a dialect in America that I'm an urban child. I grew up here in Boston. I don't even have a dialect. I can't, the way he does. This author is brilliant at this dialect, and I am not brilliant at any dialect. So I didn't quite know how to deal with that. And what I came away with was an experiment, which is that I created what I felt was kind of a vocabulary collection of words, a little dictionary for myself of what words that I felt were sort of rural sounding, but not specific to any one place. But it's a very, very dicey thing to do. And I put it together, and there's some words that a lot of different parts of the United States use. I looked also around here in New England dialects a little bit, but I didn't want anything to sound like it was in the United States because the story is taking place in Croatia, not in the United States. It's a horrible thing to be faced with, and it was an extremely popular book in Croatia, in Croatian, one of the most popular books the last 10 years. And so when I was in Croatia last time, the author and I gave various talks that we did together about how we worked on it. And there were some fun things that we developed together, but it was very, very challenging to do, very challenging. And I've never felt that it came close to the intensity of the original because that dialect is so powerful.
Now, you have been the past president of ALTA. ALTA is a very renowned organization across the world. But introduce us to ALTA. Tell us about your stint at ALTA too. Yeah.
Yeah, I was president first for 2 years in 2019, 2020. And then I handed it off to my colleague Annie Fisher, who had been my vice president. And then she became president in November of 2020. And then in 2021, in the spring, the war broke out when Russia invaded Ukraine. And during that time, she was a professor of Russian and she was devastated by the war. And she asked me if I could come back and continue out her term. So I agreed to do that because I too have been through a war and I know how difficult that is. And I had great sympathy for her situation. So I came back in March of 2021 and then I finished just now in November of 2023. And the new president took over, Chen Xinjiang. Who's a wonderful president. ALTA is a very interesting organization, and it's changed a lot in the years that I've been involved. It started out, I think I've been going to ALTA meetings for 20 years, so maybe more. And so it was a much smaller organization, but because literary translation has gotten a great deal of attention in the last period of time. I'm not sure exactly how to date it, but we now have Masters of Fine Arts programs in literary translation in Boston and Arkansas and in Iowa and various places. There have been a lot of graduate students and young professionals who have taken a great interest in literary translation and are coming to our conference. So unlike some disciplines which get older and older and sort of fade away, we're getting younger and younger and growing as an organization, which is very interesting. This last conference was our first in-person conference after COVID. We had a smaller meeting, but this was our first major conference. 40% of the people who came, it was their first time of coming to an in-person conference. So this was huge for us to see that kind of interest. We have learned a great deal at the American Literary Translators Association from the English Association within the translation association in the UK, because they have done all kinds of really interesting things and they have given us examples of how to develop, and they have really been valuable to the American literary. Danny Hahn and others, Roz Schwartz and many others within the UK organization have been really elemental in moving us forward. And it's a little bit more of a challenge in a place like the United States because we're so big, whereas in the UK they can gather in one place much more easily. But we do then have these big annual conferences, and that really is, well, for ALTA, the annual conference always has been the biggest thing that we did was the annual conference. Now we have mentorships and travel fellows and all sorts of other things that we organize a huge initiative of South Asian mentorships that Danny Hahn and others have put together. And that's been a huge boon.
You have translated many works of renowned Serbian author David Albahari. Now, please tell us about David Albahari and some of his important works.
So David Albahari was a writer who, while I was still living in Zagreb, when I was making this turn towards translating literature, I found a couple of writers I really liked and began trying out translating some of their work. And David's was one of the first I found, and particularly his short stories. I was fascinated by them, and contacted him and went and met him in Belgrade and asked if it was okay if he was asked to give somebody something in translation, could I do that? And he was delighted and said yes, indeed. And so I showed him what I'd done. He liked it, as you probably know. He himself translated a great deal from English into Serbian, so his English was very good, and he appreciated translation as a profession, and it was a pleasure working with him. We hardly ever had the opportunity to actually, so to speak, be in the same room, because not long after he and I got together for our coffee in Belgrade, he moved to Canada and I moved to the States. It was right at the end of the 80s, just as we were beginning to do that. And so there's an interesting story along those lines. But his writing, he was very interested. He was kind of a rock musician, and he was interested in rock music. He wrote a lot about rock music. He was fascinated by experimental prose, and he loved postmodern prose. And I think one thing that's important to understand, both for his writing and for the writing of a Croatian writer whose work I've also translated, Dubravka Ugrešić, is that both of them were interested in postmodernism, both because it was the flavor of the month in the 1980s, but also because the 1980s were the decade after Tito died, when all these historical novelists were discovering all the atrocities that had been committed against Serbs or Croats by the Yugoslavs, by the partisans, by Tito's government. And they were publishing these, the only way I can describe them is these grievance novels, exposing Tito's regime for all kinds of terrible things. And they were very nationalistic, and they were very focused on local, as I said, grievances, on local issues during World War II, after World War II, people being put in prison camps for speaking out, being pro-Stalin. People who were pro-Stalin were put in prison camps by Tito so that they would back him and not, so that the country would back him and not Stalin after 1948. So both David Albahari and Dubravka Ugrešić were writers at a time when they chose not to write that way. They didn't want to write nationalist literature. They didn't want to write grievance literature. They wanted to explore writing for the sake of literature, for the sake of exploring what a novel can do, what prose can do. And both of them became very engaged in that. And it was kind of a battle that they were fighting. And their stories, I mean, David Albahari's stories, sure, they take place sort of in Serbia, but there's nothing particularly Serbian about most of them. Götz and Meyer gets into World War II and in Belgrade, but most of his stories are kind of, like a man and a woman talking about art in a city somewhere. They're not tied up with historical issues much. Later, some of his writing gets, but I really liked that aspect of his writing. I was very attracted to it. He and Dubravka Ugrešić were the writers of my generation. And so for me, I wanted to give that generation a voice, and I felt it was important. So that was sort of what started us off. And he's written a lot more novels than have been translated. I've translated, I think, 5 of his novels and 2 of his collections of stories. But he has many more novels that haven't been translated. And he wrote quite a few of them after he was in Calgary, Canada, in Alberta, in Canada, for a long time, maybe more than 10 years. Yeah, probably 15 years, and then came back to Serbia and was living there until he died last summer. But so for the time that he was away, a lot of his novels explored the identity of living in sort of abroad as an expatriate. And when he came back, then he began writing novels that had more to do with what was going on in Serbia in various ways, but always from a distance, always focusing on literature as the focus of what he felt was the most important.
If somebody wants to read Albahari, which book they should start with? Once you have translated.
I would say, if you're looking to read his things in English, I would recommend his collection of short stories called Words or Something Else. That was something that is it's his early writing before he left the country. Then the second thing is Götz and Meyer, which is his best novel. I think everybody agrees that it's his best novel that I've run into. It's a very powerful novel about Jews in Belgrade during World War II. And then my favorite is Snowman. It's backwards in this. but you asked me to read a passage and I chose a passage from that. So but it's very he has this wonderful style that I loved translating, which is this. It's about drama and it's about humor, and they're all connected. It's very funny and very traumatic all at the same time.
Few months ago, when I was reading about you, I came across your involvement with ICTY. In fact, I could get the copy of the book too, which is 326 pages, translating evidence.
Yes.
And it just blew me away. The kind of work that you have put in is really astonishing. I think I wrote to you about it also.
Huh?
Whatever, I was thinking of translation and its value addition to literature and all, this takes it to a totally different level. It's a very different kind of work, and it's a record of some terrible human tragedy, if I may have to put it that way, so that it keeps reminding us what we should not get into. It's such a monumental work. It just blew me away, actually. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to you for having looked at it. It's when I was working there, I was amazed by how translation was front and center in the middle of everything that went on every day. And there were over 10,000 sessions of trials in the 20 years that the tribunal was functioning, more than 20 years, more than 10,000 sessions. And there wasn't a single session, I think, that translation wasn't mentioned at least once, because people were always discussing how something was translated, what it was translated, and querying the translation, trying to clarify the translation. It was constant. And I just thought that was so interesting to see translation so visibly, because we always talk about how it goes on behind the scenes, and to be able to see it so tangibly like that was really interesting.
I was wondering, see, you were also mentioning about it. I was really wondering, as a translator, while you're translating, you go through the emotions because you get into the thick of the things. What kind of emotional impact it had on you? Engaging with this for a long period.
Well, it's complicated. Everything having to do with emotions is complicated in general, but in that particular situation, it was complicated because, yes, the subject matter was deeply distressing, often traumatizing, the work that we did on it. But on the other hand, the war was deeply distressing. And I had been involved when I went to work there. It was 1998. The war wasn't quite over yet. That happened after 1999 with the NATO bombing of Serbia. But the main war that I was involved with personally was in Bosnia and Croatia, and that ended in 1995. So, but But during that time, I was deeply involved and very upset by everything that was happening there. We had moved to the United States in 1990. I had started working on my dissertation, and then the war began. Not even as we were leaving the country in 1990, things were beginning to happen, that the banks were shutting down. Dramatic things were going on that were not the whole bank, but the foreign currency accounts were shutting, and all sorts of ominous things were happening as my family and I were coming over here. And so we were already frightened and alarmed, and then watching the news and going through that. And my children's childhood was all caught up in how awful the war was. So in 1998, when I was invited to come and work there by my colleague who was asked to set up the language services, someone I'd known for a long time, I was relieved, because I finally felt you're sort of just like passively soaking up all this awful stuff. And then finally, my skill set was useful. And I could be, it just felt like almost like a healing moment, that I could go and do something about it. Now, how effective the tribunal has been, that's an open discussion and not one for our conversation. But at the time when I got the invitation to come, and I went the first summer in 1998, I was thrilled. I was really thrilled to be able to go there and even just to see it as an organization and learn from it. Now, of course, I got right into the very disturbing material, and we had a stricture, a limitation placed on us within the translation unit, that we couldn't tell other people about what we were working on, even within the tribunal. And part of the reason for that is that what the defense worked on had to be secret from what the prosecution worked on, for various reasons of the way trials work and disclosure, and the fact that the prosecution had to disclose to the defense, but the defense did not have to disclose to the prosecution. So the defense could surprise the prosecution in the courtroom with things that the prosecution would know nothing about until that minute. So we had to be very careful, because we worked on documents for both the prosecution and the defense all the time. And in fact, a lot of the time, I didn't even really pay that much attention to whether it was a defense document or a prosecution document. We were just translating those documents. And I worked in documents. I didn't work in the courtroom in the booth. I was working on documents, on the translation of documentary evidence. And so we just had to be very careful never to speak about the things that we worked on. And that, you pay a toll for that, because you can't, but we could talk among ourselves, the revisers in my room who were checking for accuracy of the translation. And also we could talk with the translator who had translated the document we were working on, and to ask them how they felt about it, and talk if it was a very difficult document. But there were bad days. I mean, it was heartbreaking. A lot of that material was.
Yeah, I think it went on for years, right?
Yeah, it started in 1993 and it closed in 2017. And after 2017, they founded something called the residual mechanism, which is dealing with all the little things, the ongoing issues there were a few trials that they needed to finalize. And I think that those may all have been finalized by now, some appeals that needed to be finalized. And then there just has to be, and it's both the Rwandan tribunal and the Yugoslav tribunal are together in the residual mechanism. They run the archive, the online archive. They deal with issues that arise. All kinds of things might come up. They have to deal with following up on the work of the tribunal.
So one of the other translator we interviewed, John Hodgson.
Oh, yes. A very dear friend of mine with whom I worked very closely.
In fact, we recently interviewed him because one of his books was longlisted for Booker. Yeah, Dictator Calls. Yeah, right. Now, how many translators were involved in this ICTY project?
Well, the tribunal went from small to large to small. And during that time, as far as I could tell when I was writing the book, I checked, at any moment, 10% of the staff were translators. So at the beginning, there were 100 people, so 10 of them were translators. When I was working there were 1,500 people, so 150 were translators and interpreters. And it was about half and half, 75 translators, 75 interpreters. And John, for example, John Hodgson was working from Albanian into English, and I was working from the languages of Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia into English. And there was also after John left, another translator came named Robert Elsey, who was also working from Albanian into English, another wonderful friend. But yes, those are dear friends. Well, we've all stayed connected. Quite a few people actually were killed by COVID who I worked with, but yes, that was a terrible thing. Uh, but the people that work together in those very difficult circumstances, it's a strong bond that you create with people in those settings.
Please read a passage from
Ah,
one of the Serbian works that you really loved translating.
well, what I chose was a passage. Here's the cover of the book I showed you, Snowman. It's a passage from Snowman. This novel is about, just to provide a little context, it's about a man who's never named. He's a first person narrator, and he never is referred to by name. And he's moved from a war zone, he doesn't say where, to another country, and he doesn't say what that country is, but we know that he was coming from Serbia and that the country is Canada. And he has been invited to be a guest writer at a university. So this scene that this little passage is from, this, I would say paragraph, but the whole novel is one paragraph. He didn't write paragraph breaks in his novels. It's all just the whole novel, one paragraph. So I can't refer to this as a paragraph, but it's like a paragraph. This paragraph-like passage takes place at the faculty club of the university, and he's having lunch with a professor of political science who is telling him his theories about the author's country, and the author doesn't like it. So here it goes first in Serbian. Ne znam zapravo kako sam pojao taj ručak. Neprekidno izlagan i znatiželjnim i nezainteresovanim pogledima. Posle svakog upoznavanja, kao i posle svake razmene misli sa profesorom političkih nauka, ispijao sam malo tečnosti, prvo belo vino, potom vodu, onda mlaku kafu i na kraju sam zatražio sok od pomoranđe, toliko su mi usta bila suva od gneva i uzbuđenja. Kad je profesor političkih nauka upotrebio reč eksperiment, vaša zemlja je bila neuspješni eksperiment, bile su njegove riječi, pomislio sam da ću se one svestiti. Samo me je stid od skandala, kao i uvek, u ostalom sprečio da ustanem. Moja zemlja je bila neuspešni eksperiment, ponovio sam, uz odmahivanje glavom i oblizivanje ispucalih usana. Profesor je moje ponavljanje shvatio kao moje slaganje. Da, vikao je i udarao se po butinama. Neuspešni eksperiment. Možda nije trebalo da se one svestim, pomislio sam. Možda je trebalo da ga raspalim vinskom flašom po čelu, što me je odjednom smirilo. Počeo sam mirnije da dišem, ni usta mi više nisu bila tako suva. Čak su mi se usne, osetio sam, razvukle u osmeh. Profesor je moj osmeh shvatio kao dodatno slaganje. Naručio je novu flašu vina i počeo da razrađuje svoju teoriju neuspešne države, koja, tvrdio je, rađa neuspešne sisteme, neuspešne proizvode i neminovno, tvrdio je, neuspešne ljude. Osim malobrojnih izuzetaka, dodao je, uputivši mi značajan pogled. Svi ostali, tvrdio je dalje, samo su duhovni patuljci, zakržljale osobe koje ne svojom krivicom, naravno, nisu sposobne da uspevaju, čak ni u slučaju kad se nađu na drugom tlu u drugoj zemlji. Oni su jednostavno, tvrdio je, osuđeni na skučenost duha. Sve dok, zahvaljujući mešanju i dodavanju, ne stvore novi hibrid, novu vrstu, za koju je postajao samo jedan preduslov da se oslobode nostalgije. Nostalgija ubija, rekao je profesor. Kada bi kukuruz bio nostalgičan, rekao je, nikad ne bi radio klip bogat zrevljem. Nisam znao što da kažem. Nikad nisam razmišljao sebe kao klip kukuruza. I don't actually know how I managed to eat that lunch, constantly exposed to curious yet indifferent eyes. After making each new acquaintance and after each exchange of thoughts with the professor of political science, I sipped a little liquid, first white wine, then water, then tepid coffee, and at the end I asked for orange juice. My mouth was so dry with fury and agitation. When the professor of political science used the word experiment, your country was a failed experiment, those were his words, I thought I'd faint. It was my dismay and scandal, as always, that prevented me from leaping to my feet. My country was a failed experiment, I repeated, shaking my head and licking my chapped lips. The professor took my repetition as agreement. Yes, 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 he shouted and slapped his thighs. A failed experiment. Perhaps I shouldn't faint, I thought. Perhaps I'd be better off smacking him on the head with the wine bottle. And that calmed me suddenly. I started to breathe more easily. My mouth wasn't quite so dry, and even my lips, I could feel them, had stretched into a smile. The professor took my smile to mean further approbation. He ordered a new bottle of wine and began laying out for me his theory of the failed country, which, he claimed, gave birth to failed systems, failed products, and inevitably, he claimed, failed people. With a few exceptions, he added, shooting me a meaningful glance, all the rest of them, he went on to say, are spiritual dwarfs, stunted people who, through no guilt of their own, were incapable of succeeding, not even if they were to find themselves somewhere else, abroad. They are simply, he claimed, condemned to a narrowness of spirit until, thanks to intermarriage and new blood, they form a new hybrid, a fresh species for which there will only be one precondition, that they themselves be free of nostalgia. Nostalgia kills, said the professor. If corn could feel nostalgia, he said, it would never produce cobs rich with kernels. I was at a loss for words. I had never imagined myself a corn cob.
Now, I wanted to ask, if somebody wants to read about this conflict in Yugoslavia, what do you recommend, the books?
Well, what I recommend are two things. There's a television series that was made by BBC and Discovery Channel, and it's called Death of Yugoslavia. I think it's in 5 episodes. And I always recommend it to my students or the people who are interested in learning about it, because it shows the whole way that what happened in the war and how it's not short. It would take a while to watch it, but it's well worth watching. And there's a book that goes with it, which I think is called Death of a Nation, or maybe also Death of Yugoslavia. And that's my preference.
This conversation is special, I must say. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for asking these interesting questions. I enjoyed talking with you. It's a pleasure.